Hello everyone, I made this video in response to a comment written by Stefano. He was asking how to make a player indicator that attaches above the player's head and changes color depending on what team they enter. So without anything further to do, let's jump right in. I'm gonna start by making a script for the indicator. So indicator. Okay, and then I'm gonna drag a sphere under shapes, sphere. And then I'm gonna attach the script to it, so indicator. Okay, and then since this is gonna be attachable on the player, we're gonna change it to an attachable entity. So avatar attachable, we're gonna turn that to anchor, and then we're gonna offset that on the Y by 1. I believe 1 is good enough. Okay, and then now let's edit the script. So basically how would this work is we're gonna, when the player enters, we're gonna attach this to the player that just entered, and then after that we're gonna have a gameplay tag on this entity, and whenever this object with this current tag enters the trigger, depending on which trigger it enters, it's gonna change the color. So right now we're still working on the indicator to attach on the object. So we basically need to connect the code blocks event. So this dot connect code blocks event, we're connecting it to this entity, which is the actual indicator above the player's head. And then the event we're connecting is when the player enters the world. So code block events. Oh, okay. Let's import this in another way. So just delete the HZ at the end. Both ways works the same, but I just prefer this method. I don't like writing HC at the beginning of each method imported. So code blocks events dot on player enter world. Okay, and then we're gonna call a method. Let's create a new method called on player enter world, and then it's gonna take a player of type player, and then we're just gonna call this method over here. So whenever a player is entered, it's gonna send an event to this object right here, and it's gonna call this method. And it's gonna call this method over here. Okay, and then when this happens, we're gonna attach the current entity, the indicator, to that player that just entered. So this dot entity dot as, we need to tell Horizon that this object is an attachable entity, and then dot attach to player, and then we're gonna give it the player which just entered, which is this player over here, and then attachable player anchor. So where to attach it is on the head, and this should work whenever we enter the game. It's gonna attach this sphere on our head. One thing to note, let's turn the collidability off for this one. Ooh, wait, actually let's leave it on for now. Let's test it, and as you see, this works. So let's make it smaller. Let's make the actual sphere just a little bit smaller. And let's see that again, and let's make it lower, closer to the player's head. So let's go over here, and then instead of 1, we're gonna make it 0.5. And now it attaches to the player. Let's go back to editing the script. Okay, and just note one thing. The way I attached the indicator to the head only works because I'm just one player. If another player enters, it's gonna remove it from me, and it's gonna attach it to his head. For your own game, for this to work, you need to on your play when you need to find the player manager script that you have in your game, and then whenever the player manager for each whenever a player enters, you need to attach a different sphere to each unique player, and that's how you make it work. This is not the main focus of this video. The main focus is to just change the color, but I just did this quick script just to have something to change the color of, and then we're done with this script. So just make sure you save it, and then we can exit. Okay, and now let's work on the trigger. So we're gonna create a script and bring a trigger. So trigger, and then let's bring two triggers from the build. So that's the trigger, and then we'll also grab a shape because the triggers are not visible during gameplay. So we can drag this up. We can even scale it down like that, and then let's drag the trigger on top of it like this. Okay, and since we have two teams, we're gonna duplicate this. So duplicate selection, and then we're gonna drag it. So as okay, that's a little bit, the sphere is too big. Okay, I think it was glitching. Wait, I wonder why it keeps getting bigger and bigger. I'm not sure why this is happening, to be honest. Okay, now let's work on the we can adjust that in the script here. Let's do that real fast. So let's open the indicator script. Yeah, and then before it attaches, let's update the scale of the entity. So this dot entity dot scale dot set, and it takes a vector 3, so new vec3, and then 0.5 comma 0.5 comma 0.5. Let's see if this solves the issue. And let's scale it just a little bit because it's gonna scale it again in the script. And this looks like it's working. Okay, so just add this just in case, because I don't know if it looks like Horizon is glitching. I don't think this is gonna stay for long, but for now I'm just gonna leave this line just to make sure the scale is right. And as I said, this should be handled by the player manager in your game, so this is gonna be a little bit unique for each game itself. But yeah, whenever for the game you're building, just make sure that the game manager or player manager gives an indicator for each player, and then after it gives an indicator for each player, here's when the main idea of this video is gonna come in. So we're gonna have two triggers over here, and then we're gonna assign that trigger script to it over here. Okay, and now let's edit the trigger script. So we can either open it from over there, like from the desktop editor, or we can come over here and then open it from over here. Okay, let's re-import this component. And then after that, first we need a variable to differentiate between which team they're on. So let's make a boolean called team1, and type is prop types dot boolean. Okay, and basically we just need to differentiate between which one is team 1 and which one is team 2. There's multiple ways to do that, but that's what I'm gonna be doing today. So for this one, we're gonna leave that, we're gonna set this one to team 1, Well, actually, let's change the name of the variable to is team1. This is a bit more descriptive. Okay, so for the first one, it's gonna be a team1. So is team1 it's gonna be turned on, and then for the other one, it's not. It's gonna be the other team. So we're just gonna leave this disabled. This way we can differentiate which one we're referring to in the script. Okay, and right now we just need to listen whenever an object enters this trigger. So what we can do is connect a code blocks event. So this dot connect code blocks event. We're gonna connect to this entity, to that trigger. So this dot entity, and then code block events dot on entity enters trigger. So when an object enters a trigger, and then we're gonna create a new method called on entity enters a trigger, and then it's gonna take an entity. So in the parameters over here, entity of type entity, and let's connect this over here. So this dot on entity enters trigger dot bind this, and add a semicolon. And this basically, whenever an object enters the trigger, is gonna send an event over here. So let's test that. So let's console.log something. Let's call it entity. Okay, and we're gonna, okay, this right now, the current configuration we have it's gonna apply for any object that enters the trigger, but we only want it for this object. So what we will do is we're gonna use the gameplay tags. So we're gonna come to the sphere, to the indicator over here, and then we're gonna give it a tag, a custom tag. And in my case, I'm just gonna call it indicator. Okay, and then for the triggers, I'm gonna only allow them to trigger on object tagged, and the tag that they're gonna trigger on is indicator, which the one we just gave it to the sphere or to the indicator. And same thing for that one. So object tag and indicator. Okay, since you're doing a game and you want it to trigger on a player, you're gonna have to have two different triggers on top of each other or inside of each other. So just add these extra on top of the triggers that are already there for this to work. And let's make sure that we have configured that. So object tagged indicator, and let's, okay, there you need to be taller than this. Because remember, it's gonna, the actual indicator is on top of the player's head, so if it doesn't enter that trigger, then it's not gonna work. So let's scale it. Like that. It could be scaled more. Well, they're not the exact same scale, but for learning purposes, I'm not gonna worry about that. And let's test that. So if we preview and if we enter, we see that we get a log down there in the console and says entity entered, and then same thing for this one. So it only triggers from this entity, like from the sphere above the player's head only. If there's another object, it doesn't trigger that. And now we have about like 80% done of this. So the rest thing to do is just to update the color. So to update the color, first we need to increase the tint on this object. Oh, this is also a new thing. I didn't know this existed. Previously, I mean about a month ago, I couldn't change, maybe more than a month ago, but they wouldn't allow you to change the color of an object created inside there are like two kind of words. There's like the primitive one, and there's custom model import. So for the custom model import, you have to change the whole texture, but recently they added like you can change the color, so this is now available for us to use in custom model imports. You don't need to worry about that. That's just the fun information to know. So we need to increase the tint to 1. 1 is the maximum, okay? And this way when we change the color, we can actually see the color change. Okay, so basically when the sphere enters the trigger, we're gonna change the color depending on the theme. So if this dot props dot is theme 1, so this basically refers to this variable over here, and remember we have it turned on for one and turned off for the other. So if it's enabled for theme 1, you can set the entity that just entered, which is the sphere, which is this one over here, to a certain color. So this dot entity dot color dot set, and then let's set it for blue, for example. So color dot blue. Okay, and else, since we only have two themes, we don't need to specify if it's theme 2. Else, we can just say else. Else, we're gonna set it to the other color, which we can do red. And this way, when you enter the trigger, if you enter the first theme, it's gonna change the color to blue, and if you enter to red, it's gonna change it to red. And we can also add something else, but let's test that first. So start, make sure you save the script, preview, and then why is that not working? Let's make sure that we have the tint. Okay, that's the thing. Okay, that's the issue. I made a mistake. We shouldn't. This dot entity refers to the actual trigger. We're not gonna change the entity itself. We're gonna change the sphere that enters the trigger. So it should be only entity. That's a mistake on my end. So just entity. Oh, and this explains why it wasn't changing colors. Okay. Let's change this back to white. Okay, and hopefully when we test this right now, it's gonna work. And as you see, this works. We can even make the indicator a bit smaller. So 0.3, 3, and 3. And if you don't want it to show up, like you want it to only show up when you enter the trigger, you can initially set it to not visible, and then you can make it visible when you enter the trigger. So how this would work is you're gonna turn off the visibility for this one initially, so visible to false, and then when you enter the trigger over here in the trigger section, after you change the color depending on which theme they are on, you can set the visibility of the entity. So entity dot visible dot set to true, and this way it's not gonna be visible, but when they enter the trigger, it's gonna be visible. And let's test that. And as you see, there's nothing on top of our head. Technically there is, but it's not visible. And then when we enter, it turns the visibility on, and it even changes color. If you have any more questions on doing scripting stuff in TypeScript, please leave them down in the comments below. Also, make sure that they're detailed for me to understand them enough, because if you give me like not detailed stuff, it's hard for me to like generate the code that you'd actually use in your gameplay. Also, if you enjoyed and learned something new, drop a like down below, and thank you so much. See you next time.